One major issue that is a bit difficult to ascertain has been the possibility of getting the exact information about the number of slaves that were moved from Africa to other parts of the world. To handle this situation, a group of historians came together and established a database which they tend to be updating steady. This database has been a center of research analysis which tend to bring some level of information. This platform is a website referred to as the slavevoyages.org. slavevoyages.org. The database at slavevoyages.org is a powerful resource for historians seeking to understand the scale of Africans forcefully taken away in slave ships by European dealers. Since the 1960s, historians have systematically collected evidences on the transatlantic slave trade. Advances in computing technology have made it easier to gather and compare data on various aspects of the transatlantic slave trade. An international team of historians created slavevoyages.org in order to provide detailed information on each voyage recorded in newspapers, trade ledgers, ships' logs, and other sources available at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st centuries. These sources, written in multiple languages and spread across 3 continents, have been compiled into a collaborative database that is continually updated and remains a work in progress. This database is an invaluable tool of analyzing the number of slaves or the number of slaves that were captured between 1514 and 1866. And this number tends to be estimated to around 12,500,000 Africans that were moved into slavery during this period. Now let's look at some analysis of these coming out from this website called slavevoyages.org. The database serves as an excellent resource for understanding various aspects of the transatlantic slave trade. Now let us look at the positivities then before we go into the shortcomings. The first one, based on the positivity, is the mortality during the Middle Passage. The mortality during the Middle Passage. The database reveals that approximately 12,500,000 Africans embarked on slave ships, but only around 10.7 million arrived in America. This significant difference highlights the extreme high mortality rates on slave ships. The next one that tends to be a positive reality from the database is the voyage-specific data. With information on about 36,000 slaving voyages, the database provides detailed records. However, detailed about these enslaved individuals such as gender, age, or name are often missing. So the database tend not to have enough information about the gender, the possible age, and the names of some of these slaves. Another positive reality was the chronological phases. The chronological phases. The exact dates for many voyages in the database allowed historians to analyze by year fluctuations in the transatlantic slave trade. This tend to explain to some of these researchers about the possible periods in the year when many or high number of slaves were moved, and the periods when low number of slaves were moved. Another one is seasonal patterns. Seasonal patterns. Sailors followed specific seasonal patterns based on Atlantic navigation conditions. The supply of African coasts, or the supply from African coasts, and the demand that were to be in the American ports. All these details that were in the database tend to give information about the seasonal patterns. The next one is the port of embarkation. The port of embarkation. The database identifies the exact port where enslaved Africans were shipped to America. However, it does not provide information on the slaves' region of origin, as many were captured inland. So the areas from which most of these slaves were brought out from the interior of Africa tend to be missing in the database. The next one is slave traders and ships' identities. The database often reveals the identity of slave traders and their ships, as well as the ports from which they sailed, highlighting which traders, ports, countries benefited most from the trade. The next one is slave revolt. The database showed that there were African revolts on approximately 1 out of every 10 European ships. The database showed that there were African revolts on approximate of 1 out of every 10 European ships. This tends to state that it wasn't an easy movement for these European slave dealers. The next one was ship destinations. The database often indicates where slaves disembarked and were sold, though it does not account for subsequent resale after arrival in America. Now, despite its values, the database had faced some dysfunctional or criticisms. Some of the shortcomings that can be seen in the database are these. The first one is that the database lacked details about the nature of the slave trade itself. Another one is that the database does not explain the reasons behind the transatlantic slave trade or its impact on African societies. The next one is that the database accuracy or the accuracy of the data is sometimes questionable. This is because of some noticeable discrepancies found by researchers when compared to the original documents. Now, the next one is that some historians argue that the database perpetuated the perspective of the slave traders, treating slaves as mere statistics and relying solely on documents created by those involved in the trade. Well, the database may have its positive and negative areas, but it is a very important place for those working towards getting information about the transatlantic slave trade.